And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Debbie Kasper, who is a sociologist and associate professor of environmental studies at Hiram College in Northeast Ohio, USA. She works at the intersection of sociological theory, social environmental studies, and on-the-ground action. She's interested in understanding leverage points for systemic change. Her 2021 book, Beyond the Knowledge Crisis, introduces an integrative framework for social environmental studies and a general theory of social change, themes she explores further in her blog, Getting to Know Reality. As a teacher, she has developed a wide range of classes, including social environmental studies, system thinking and social change, permaculture basics, community, food, eaters, eating and the environment, and more. She also holds the permaculture design certificate. Is a certified meditation instructor, and has studied soil biology and compost. Among her current projects are writing a new book and creating a campus farm to test and demonstrate widely accessible strategies for regenerating degraded land, producing food and other resources, and enhancing community resilience. So the title of her talk is Basic Training for the Relay Race to Transition. So please mute yourself during the presentation, and the floor is yours, Debbie. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip, and thank you all for being here. It's so good to be here this morning, or whatever time it is where you are. Here in the US, we just had to change our clocks back, and so when I walked into work this morning and my clock said 10:05, I had a moment of panic, but realized it's okay. I'm not late yet. So anyway, it's so nice to have an opportunity to interact with some SCORAI folks. And actually to thank you directly, and those who aren't present, for so many years of good conversations. I really appreciate what everyone shares, and I hope I can offer something of interest and value today. So I'm going to share my screen and then get started. Oh, Philip, would you mind making me a co-host so I can share a screen? You're muted, so if you want to let me know if it's working or not. Oh, I can do it now. Thank you. Okay, can everybody see my screen? All right, let me just hide the controls so those don't get in my way the whole time. There we go. Okay. All right, so Philip wrote to me after I chimed in on a lively listserv exchange that revolved around what's probably the most frequently asked question with regard to any of our crises, and that is, what can we do? And it's a common question, but for professionals like us, it takes on the particular flavors of our interests or our activities. So teachers want to know, what do we tell students? Organizers want to know how to empower citizens, and so forth. And I totally sympathize with that. But I felt a resistance to his kind invitation to speak. One of the reasons is that, as Philip said, I'm a sociologist. And as if that doesn't make me strange enough, I'm a sociological theorist. And I already know that it's really difficult to boil down big abstract ideas into pithy remarks. And I know that theory isn't necessarily what people want to hear in situations where we want immediate answers. So I was a little worried that anything I might have to say might be found unsatisfying. But secondly, somewhat related, is that there's a part of me that feels like if I don't have all the answers, then I can't legitimately speak on these matters. And intellectually, I know that's silly, but on some level, it still holds me back. And I think a lot of us feel this way. I think when we look at what we're facing, the situations are so big and complex with so many layers and scales that it's really easy to get overwhelmed and want to just stay in your disciplinary lane, do the conventional thing, or just give up and give into the demands of everyday life. So almost as if responding to myself, one of the things I said in this particular email exchange was something like, yeah, it's true, there's so much to be done and nobody can do it all, but our different skills and inclinations can be put to good use in these different arenas. But that to be most effective, each type of work ideally needs to know and more clearly show where it fits in the bigger picture. So this is the point I want to talk about today, specifically addressing you all, professionals in what I call socio-environmental studies. To date, we have not had that bigger picture, and so we can't easily see where our efforts fit relative to others, and therefore can't coordinate or collaborate in the ways needed. So therein lies the challenge. For years, I had been tuned into this problem, and it seemed that everywhere I looked, I saw socio-environmental scholars from across the disciplinary spectrum clamoring for a framework that could fit it all in. Meanwhile, some of us have been running as hard as we can in this race to transition, often with certain finish lines in mind, but without a larger sense of the territory and where we fit in it, and a shared understanding of basic rules, we often run in different directions, feeling like we're not getting anywhere. Certainly it is a race, and it feels like time is not on our side, but in reality, it's more of a relay race, and we don't have a clear finish line, and we are but one set of runners. And we need to be really clear on this because the conditions that we've been handed and what we do with them will determine the conditions for the next set of runners. Without knowing the terrain or having clarity about the ground rules, we're not likely to perform well as a team. Fortunately, these are solvable problems. We can train in ways that equip us to move faster in the right direction so that when we hand off the baton, we can put the next runners in a better position. And every little incremental improvement matters. In my opinion, it's our obligation to do so. And so this is the basic training I'll talk about today. Fair warning, it will involve some theory, and we will at some point ascend rapidly to satellite heights so that we can zoom out and sufficiently take in a bigger picture. So buckle up and get ready to use your imaginations to fill in some of the details. So here's what I'll cover. I'll say a bit about why we haven't had a bigger picture, with special attention to key problems in our fundamental paradigms. I'll show how addressing those lends itself to the development of an integrative framework, a reliable map of the socio-environmental territory we're in, and we'll conclude by suggesting some practical ways we can begin to make sense of this map to shed light on questions of what do we do and how can we do it better together. So I want to begin by establishing my premises, and I think it's worth going way back to note how the evolution of our species and the adaptations that conferred brought enormous benefits in terms of our survival and reproduction, and also furnished us with the capacity to destroy the systems we depend on. Fast forwarding through various cultural, technological, energy, and other milestones along the way, up to reaching the point of ecological overshoot. In recent years, some began to recognize that business as usual spells disaster for us and countless other species, and that nothing short of systemic societal transformations will make a difference that makes a difference, like the message from UN Environmental Program Director just last week. Warnings like this have been proliferating over the past couple decades, with important work helping situate crises like climate change within a much bigger picture, as SCORAI's own Bill Reese continues to remind us. Soon to follow, one other thing first. Because of all of this, demands for systemic social change became the order of the day, in certain circles at least. And soon to follow this was the recognition that part of this change must be in our paradigms, culture, and overall way of being. For the past decade or so, I've encountered these on an almost daily basis, including from members of SCORAI, like these two examples I'm showing here. And I want to acknowledge that this reflects tremendous progress It's a shift from a narrow focus on symptoms and fixes to a deeper sense of causes. And so this is where we are, or we might say where we're stuck for the moment, given that these questions are usually where books and articles and talks end. And so for people working in the socio-environmental space, this is the question of the day. So now that we're up to speed, let's delve into some of the reasons why this question is so hard to answer. One obvious reason is just the sheer scope and complexity of the problem. But there are a couple of other reasons I want to address here, both related to a general misapprehension of human social phenomena. One is that social change remains a mystery. We have no reliable theory of social change, which has been recognized in recent years in educational programs where we continue to perpetuate this confusion, and among academics who are desperate to make better sense of things, but are disappointed by what they're not finding. As a result, most people are left generally confused about how social change works. This is one of my all-time favorite New Yorker cartoons, which I think reflects the current cognitive dissonance about how social change happens. The second thing is that although we know these phenomena and our crises are inherently interdisciplinary, we have a hard time seeing how disciplinary knowledge connects and therefore effectively using it to collaborate in the ways called for. So until we understand these things better, it's really hard to devise meaningful, lasting responses. And at the very root of this confusion, I argue, is an erroneous paradigm for making sense of our fundamental reality, of what we are and how we fit in the world with others. And this leaves us with a very distorted worldview. So, of course, talking about this paradigm, this applies broadly across modern techno-industrial societies, but I want to focus on us in particular. What are the implications of these problematic paradigms for our work? This is a bit like noticing the plank in our own eye before trying to remove the splinter from someone else's eye. It's not hard to see that, quote, other people aren't the only ones who need a paradigm shift. And I want to say it's not our fault and there's no shame in it, but becoming aware of this can be really empowering and is a necessary step, first to correct it, but then to employ and help disseminate a better paradigm more widely. At this point, it's worth reminding ourselves what paradigms are and how they relate to the crises in question. So if any of you have ever studied systems thinking, you're probably familiar with the iceberg tool, a way to analyze deeper layers of problems. For example, something happened, right? It's gotten our attention, and most problem-solving efforts tend to get expended here, reacting to events and symptoms and putting out fires. But of course, most of what concerns us doesn't come out of the blue. They're manifestations of certain trends and patterns. And underlying those are the structures that generate them. And giving rise to those structures are the many possible, are the dominant assumptions, beliefs, and mental models, the paradigms from which our systems arise. As Meadows elucidated, among the many ways we can respond to a problem, dealing at the level of paradigms offers the most leverage. This is one of the levels I'm really interested in. So what are some important features of the paradigms? The mental models, assumptions, and beliefs giving rise to the systems especially relevant to us. For example, disciplinary structures or research and publication processes, efforts to make social change, education systems, and so forth. I'm going to mention 3 of the most fundamental problems in our paradigms and then show how we can correct them and what we get in return when we do. So first is the relationship between humans and what we call the environment. We, myself included, socio-environmental professionals, have long been critical of the idea that humans are separate from the environment. We criticize expressions of human exemptionalism, both which we see in popular culture and those institutionalized, for example, like this model in economics. But I wonder, how can we possibly correct that view if we hold it ourselves? So this is just a small sampling of countless examples of how we continue to imagine human social phenomena as separate from biophysical phenomena, connected only by the lines and arrows we add. One of the best descriptions I've found of this is in a book called Panarchy, where the authors observe that there still seem to be two separate audiences in this area. Natural scientists who want to include in their world model a box called people, and social scientists interested in resource issues who wish to include in their model a box called natural environment. I have generally found that to be true in all of my examination of such models. I want to add one caveat here. I suspect that most of us really do understand these things better than it appears. But without the means to convey that understanding, without appropriate terminology and visuals and other packages to deliver it, it remains very difficult to communicate accurately and consistently to others, including ourselves. And so we unwittingly reinforce the very idea of separation we rail against. So that's the first one. Then there's the mental model of societies and individuals and their relationship. Now, I don't remember if this was in the bio, but Norbert Elias is one of my all-time favorite sociologists, and I love what he says about this. He says, quote, "To say that the individual is part of a larger whole formed with others is a very banal observation, or it would be a banal observation if so many people did not constantly fail to register it." Similar to the previous example, we constantly speak of individuals and societies as if they are self-existent, separate entities somehow opposed to each other. The terms are generally poorly defined and understood, even in my own discipline, which claims society as its subject matter. Despite knowing they're somehow related and influence each other, we aren't quite clear on how. Now, most people are never asked to envision this relationship, but when they are, they're likely to see it similar to the way my students do, with themselves at the center and with society expanding in ever-growing concentric circles outward, or imagining discrete entities that they're somehow connected to. Neither represents reality very well, and therefore makes it difficult for us to see our real place within the larger picture. This misunderstanding is especially consequential in trying to understand socio-environmental problems, where they come from, how they impact us, what's our role in them, and ultimately, what do we do about them? This brings us to our third problem. Together, both of those bad mental models obscure our understanding of fundamental socio-environmental processes, i.e., long-term social change. So historically, there have been lots of different ways to understand social change, and I represent just a few of them here. There's the idea of a fall from grace, or the divergence from a golden age. There's the linear path to inevitable progress or perfection. Or sometimes it's explained as the product of random events in a random universe. On the flip side, the product of powerful people in charge pulling the strings behind the scenes. And actually, if you think about it, we can see elements of these explanations in popular discourse about social change today. And what I want to say is that this really matters, because when wholesale transformation of social systems and lifestyles is in order, the degree to which we grasp the mechanics of change is highly consequential. Confusion about how it works leaves us ill-equipped to bring about the kinds of changes called for, and unprepared to navigate the changes that are coming. So how can we correct these paradigmatic problems? This may seem like an impossible task, and I grant you, it's a big one. But actually, as I've written elsewhere, the fix is surprisingly, even embarrassingly simple. We need only to use what we already know to situate ourselves explicitly in our bodies and in the world. And I would say this is true, especially in the social sciences. When we do that, other things fall into place. This is relevant for how we teach, how we organize disciplines, talk about our subject matter, conduct research, and more. And it begins with formulating a modest set of what we can think of as sociological principles through which to make sense of an otherwise infinite number of possible variables. So these include, in a nutshell, taking our biology seriously as social organisms who have a high degree of neuroplasticity and the corresponding capacity and need for learning, and then the interdependence that results from that. With these principles in place, believe it or not, we can correct the errors I mentioned. We can move from a picture of society and environment as separate to one of emergent levels of phenomena. Recognizing how life emerges from physical phenomena to constitute a distinct level at a higher degree of complexity, and how social phenomena emerges from biophysical conditions, the conditions it operates in, depends on, is shaped by, and helps to shape to constitute a third distinct level. This generates a radically different picture from the current mental model we have. In it, there is not even the possibility of separation because we are biophysical conditions, while we are at the same time distinct phenomena acting on them. Here, there's no need to try to reconnect society and environment. And just as a side note, this actually makes an excellent framework for teaching socio-environmental studies and a nice alternative way to think about the structure of disciplines, but that's another topic. This model puts things in proper hierarchical perspective, not in a value sense, but in a sense of what comes from what. So rather than an arbitrary picture of spheres of activity side by side, which is not at all congruent to how reality actually works. In the process, we solve a number of old puzzles in sociology, including how to better understand the nature of the individual and society and that relationship. So when we stop to remember that individuals are embodied learning beings who are born into and grow up within pre-existing structures of social interdependence, it ceases to be a mystery how stuff out there gets in here. And so instead of viewing them as two opposed entities, we see the innate valencies for connection that all of us have and the resulting patterns of interdependence people naturally form together. So this graphic on the right is from Elias's book called What is Sociology? And I don't necessarily love the diagram, but I appreciate how it captures some important features that most of those models don't, especially interdependence, power, and decentralizing the self. Seen this way, we can begin to understand, as Elias pointed out, that the individual really refers to interdependent processes in the singular and society to interdependent processes in the plural. I kind of like that way of thinking about it. I want to briefly explain two alternative concepts that are used to represent these and to help sidestep the connotations that conventional language has. So one of them is figurations. You only have to learn two new concepts, so don't worry. With this perspective, we can see that society is not a thing or a species of things, but rather a dynamic pattern of interdependent relations among people going about the business of meeting their needs and wants. The resulting figurations vary in size and other key qualities. I won't expand on these now, but I hope just showing them gives you a sense of how this concept lends itself to empirical study in a way that the generic term society does not. On the other side of the coin, we can see individuals as inherently social beings, so that's not something that has to be added. who necessarily develop within certain biophysical and figurational conditions. So remember, being biologically equipped for learning is part of our first nature. Growing up means naturally acquiring a way of being that feels second nature, an embodied sense of normal, a way of being in the world. Habitus is what some of us call this process, an ongoing product of embodied social learning. Neurally plastic as we are, we remain an open system of dispositions, constantly subject to experiences, and therefore constantly affected by them in ways that either reinforce or modify them. So Tyler, if you've read the Ecological Habitus paper, some of this should sound familiar to you. So this concept captures this relational process, including the very activities through which we express these ways of being. These two steps, seeing levels of phenomena and the human condition of dynamic interdependence, combined with zooming way out to get a bigger picture and longer term view, reveals a basic pattern of socio-environmental processes, which lends itself to a general theory of social change, taking us from having no reliable shared theory to a shared sense of these basic dynamics. So we get a universally applicable framework here. In this spiral over on the right, each layer represents an undefined moment in time. And okay, so warning, this is the part where we get to blast off to a satellite view, and let's see what we can see from up there. Similar to the way that satellite imagery allows us to see patterns of cloud cover and net primary productivity and outlines of continents, from this metaphorical distance, we too can see things not visible from the ground. So we can detect a basic pattern. In it, we see various processes happening simultaneously. So these are some of the things I just described, albeit they're happening at different rates on different levels. So we can assume beneath each of these sort of large things that we're looking at are all kinds of levels and scales happening underneath it. So at the same time as there's a lot happening simultaneously, there's also a certain order of conditioning influences at work, also via numerous processes and scales. So walking you through this diagram, one important thing to notice is how this perspective prompts attention immediately to biophysical conditions as our basis. So for example, the climate, natural resources, built environment, technologies, and the role they play in shaping human life. This is just a small set of the many things that entails. It also points us to the patterns of relations that develop within those, be they small and local or stretched across the globe. These are the patterns through which we meet our needs and wants, or what we call figurations. Within those, people are born, develop, and build systems of schemas and acquire a sense of normal and express that both as individuals and as collectives in the stuff we make and do and the ways we do all of that, which has impacts on other people in the world. And those impacts influence subsequent biophysical conditions, which in time influence our relational patterns and so on. So using the terms I introduced earlier, there is the basic pattern happening at any given moment. I realize it's at a very high level of synthesis, but hopefully the general ideas make sense. Putting these individual moments together gives us another important element in the model, and that is change over time. So here the spiral depicts the overall forward momentum that is always taking place and reminds us that what's happening at any given moment is necessarily conditioned by what came before and furnishes the basis of what comes next. In providing a frame large enough to include biophysical and social phenomena, and doing so in a way that is very comprehensive, but also parsimonious and universally applicable across time and place, this framework offers us two important things. One is a scientifically grounded theory of social change. And 2 is a means previously unavailable for organizing information about complex socio-environmental issues. So I'll briefly address these 2 and then I'll wrap up. So a reliable theory to guide the study of social change. The components of the framework that you just saw conveniently translate into a series of interrelated and iterative questions which can direct our inquiry in valuable ways. So taken separately or together and tailored to a specific topic, these questions inform efforts to explore and explain social change, to anticipate social change, and to guide social change. There's not time to discuss each of these individually, but given that this last one is directly related to our question of how to make the changes needed, it's worth pausing here for a moment to see how it might work. So if you can imagine, we'll start over there on the left side of the screen with impacts. If you can imagine some socio-environmental impact we'd like to change, whether it's minimizing something negative or maximizing something positive. This framework leads us through a series of questions, beginning with questions about which activities and practices are most associated with those impacts. That's not too shocking, that's pretty standard, but it further leads us to think about those as expressions of a certain kind of habitus, prompting us to wonder what kind of habitus or second nature would lend itself to the desired practices. And then what figurational patterns would support the development of those qualities. And finally, what biophysical conditions would support those and help sustain the intended changes in other ways. The main takeaway here is that the holistic line of questioning this framework prompts is a significant advancement. And one of its greatest assets is the way it encourages a focus on deeper conditions, giving rise to some of the phenomena of interest. Especially noteworthy here is the way that our impacts can be traced back to our patterns of social relations. And it suggests that ultimately it's these that must be reconfigured, cutting, adding, and rearranging as needed. Still, it suggests a wide range of entry points for action, some immediate, some long-term. In this way, it encompasses both triage, the kind of immediate actions needed to take care of the most acute problems, as well as actions aimed at sustaining whatever positive changes we do manage to achieve, and ushering in the kinds of changes to our systems and culture that we need to be developing in the long term. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I've been seeing it as similar to the way that adjuvant cancer therapies, for instance, can render the acute treatments more effective, while at the same time paving the way for holistic long-term well-being. So just to note, these sets of questions are not meant to be taken on by any one person. Rather, they represent numerous areas in the field of socio-environmental studies at different scales. And as such, they give us a way to situate ourselves in this vast landscape. It offers a more useful way to think about where disciplines fit within socio-environmental studies, for example. So here's just one depiction of how the subject matter of traditional disciplines relates to each other within this framework. Notice that these placements are not mutually exclusive, and they may vary according to project. There are no hard and fast rules here, but I think it offers a useful guide that we currently don't have. Because if you think about how what are typically called environmental science or environmental studies are the way they show disciplines in them, they usually look something like this, right? No matter how pretty the graphics are, it doesn't really tell us how things fit together. So we end up with this sense that there's a little of this and a little of that. So I think this framework is useful for situating them. And here's another example, which actually situates your own, the SCORAI members' areas of expertise in the socio-environmental framework. And I want to take a moment to thank you all who responded. It was fun to see your answers. And it's just a quick attempt, obviously, based on little info, but it hints at the potential of being able to see where our questions and findings and research fit, where we can best draw from and why, what gaps we might help fill and questions we can answer, and where fruitful collaborations could happen. Finally, just for fun, here's another one, locating respondents according to how they described the main focus of their work. And so you can see how I've split it up. I think it's kind of fun to see where people fall. So depending upon where they place themselves, and just to see how we're distributed. So even with just this initial glimpse, we can begin to imagine how being able to place our own or others' activities in a larger framework like this makes it easier to know and then to show where our work fits in the bigger picture, which gets us back to the original point. I can imagine lots of other uses too, like as a way to structure an interactive database for organizing and visualizing information, for teaching about social change, for planning long-term collaborative research projects, and for forging pathways to making the kinds of changes we need. I personally am not in a position to make these things happen, but I know that lots of other people are. There are organizations who are working on trying to figure out how to synthesize vast quantities of information to be able to tell a big story, or to coordinate academic efforts. PLAN, the Planetary Limits Academic Network, is one example. Not to mention, we have a massive teaching and research infrastructure already in place, which could be far better leveraged. However challenging the task may be, with this framework, we have a tool we have not had before, taking it from impossible to just plain hard. So can we steer long-term social change more intentionally? Is it possible? I think unequivocally, yes. Will we do it? I have no idea. What I do know is that having more people with a more accurate sense of the terrain and a map we can use to know where we are in it would certainly give us a better chance. And as runners in the relay race to transition, it's our responsibility to train as best we can. I hope that my work can contribute in some small way to that. So thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. You give us a lot to think about, and it's such a beautiful presentation. So